afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another of our keynote talks in this Popularizing STEM conference. Before we start, please allow me to remind our audience that they should keep their cameras and microphones muted until the Q&A session begins. That said, I am delighted to present our speaker for this plenary session, Dr. André Brock. Dr. Brock, welcome. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Just to provide you with a short introduction to his work, just let me say that André Brock is an associate professor of media studies at Georgia Tech. He writes on Western technoculture, Black technoculture, and digital media. His scholarship examines Black and white representations in social media, video games, web blogs, and other digital media. And he has also published influential research on digital research methods. His award-winning book, Distributed Blackness, African-American Cybercultures, theorizes Black everyday lives mediated by network digital technologies. Today, Dr. Brock will present a talk entitled On Race and Technoculture, where he will introduce Black technoculture as a complement to Afrofuturism, review some recent media examples, talk about its ontological and methodological limitations, and describe Black technoculture as a mundane exploration of time and space mediated by the digital. So again, Dr. Brock, thank you so much for being here. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Good evening or afternoon to everyone, and thanks for joining me for this keynote presentation. I'm sure the conference has been a delight, although my week has been so hectic because apparently it's conference season that I haven't been able to attend many of the presentations. But I hope to continue your delight with this provocation that I offer to you that I've titled On Race and Technoculture, but that will explore Afrofuturism and Black technoculture. I'm asking you to consider a reboot because Afrofuturism is a powerful framework for understanding Black engagement with technology, time, and space, but I believe that it's underpowered for analyses of Black engagement with today's digital technologies. In this presentation, I offer a supplemental framework, Black technoculture, for analyses of the Black digital as an Afrofuture. Black technoculture theorizes everyday existence enacted through digital practices, and rather than as an appropriate future state for the vivification of Blackness. To exemplify this framework, I offer my conceptualization of Black technocultural practice in framed and expanded by digital sociality, by the quotidian, and by Afro-Optimism. And I'll exemplify this by giving you a couple of examples of what I call the Black post-present or Black kairos. I have this quote from Vanessa Gelfenboim that I found really inspirational as I was working through this presentation and the research that this is based on. And I'll read it with you. The individual is not swept up in the overarching movement of history toward the inevitable future, nor is he trapped by the eternal recurrence of history. He resides in a private universe where utopia exists on the level of the quotidian, where individual decisions and actions create the future rather than merely correspond to it. And this kind of summarizes my argument, a TLDR, if you will. And I say so because I feel, if you are familiar with Christina Sharp's work in The Wake or other Black theoretical texts talking about the Middle Passage, that in many cases, studies of Blackness in this modern era draw upon the Middle Passage as a traumatic event, one which is eternally recurrent in our current day and time, thanks to modernity and capitalism, right? And under certain paradigms, this traumatic experience of slavery keeps recurring, right? Even as we are moved forward towards history. Right. So for me, Gelfenboim's claim of individual agency, creating the future rather than corresponding to it, captures the essence of Black digital practice on Twitter and elsewhere, leading to my claim that we should consider present day activities on social and digital media, or at least the archiving of them, as worthy of Afrofuturistic inquiry. For Blackness and for the West, technoculture should be understood as a set of relations between and politics of culture, modernity, and technology. Afrofuturism and Western technoculture articulate starkly different libidinal tensions between Blackness, the technical, and the technological. In Western technoculture, Blackness is theorized as a technical object to be acted upon for the disposal of white political and economic pleasure. In Afrofuturism, Blackness is theorized as a technological agency, right? Or to be deployed for the construction of an appropriate future state for the technological vivification of Black agency. I feel that Black technoculture, at least in my conceptualization, offers a third way. It incorporates the quotidian by examining the materiality, temporality, and meaning-making capacities of the Black digital and its practitioners as a technological mediation of the post-present. In this conceptualization, Black technoculture can also be employed as a method and as an ideology to complement Afrofuturism's literary and artistic approach to race, technology, and society. So I've done a lot of talking. Let me see if I can start to expand upon my claims and perhaps give you some examples. I feel that Afrofuturism and Black technoculture constitute what Charles Mills calls a Black Enlightenment. And in his recent article, The Illumination of Blackness, he describes the Black Enlightenment as a Black light, analogous to a penetrating X-ray vision into the workings of Euro-created polities and related patterns of Eurocognition, both factual and moral. And I feel that this claim also illuminates both Afrofuturism's and Black technoculture's engagement with modernity and technology. And for me, one of the most compelling claims in Mill's essay is that the Negro, the Black, the nigger had to rethink and reinvent and reassert himself or herself as a person of equal moral standing, not through the attempt to escape the taint of Blackness, if you wish to consider it a taint, right? Or the racial sign of the natural slave, because that's inescapable in modernity, despite attempted cultural assimilation or even attempts at miscegenation through breeding with non-Blacks, right? But instead, the Negro reconceptualizes himself through revalorization and resignification of the sign of Blackness. Race cannot be avoided, so race must be confronted and then suitably transformed. So Afrofuturism as Black Enlightenment offers a path, if not necessarily a praxis, to speculate upon possibilities for certain Black formulations of technology use and design. It strongly reorients the Western figuration, more coffee, of Blackness and technology, but I don't feel it goes far enough. Its liberatory stance and aesthetic politics work together to address the problem of whiteness as technology. And in the process, it proffers a subject-oriented re-envisioning of heteromasculinity and utopian Black technocultures. But this proffering often leads to a respectable Black agency, an appropriate Black techno-future, right? And so these same politics and aesthetics do little to challenge the technocultural qualities of progress, the hygienic capacities of modernity, or how to coexist within the information confines of late modernity. I call Afrofuturism a polemic politic powered from a hyper-awareness that summarily represents Blackness and technology as an inventive response to the constitutive trauma of slavery through tropes and resistance. This is not a bad thing. I also understand that Afrofuturism's 2.0 has offered an initiative to extend Afrofuturism to incorporate philosophy, religion, architecture, communications, and visual arts, or as Ronaldo Anderson calls, for a release from the confining and crippling slave or colonial mentality through engagement with the new technical possibilities offered by the digital, the material, through code, and through praxis. So let me jump, as I usually do, to one of the most visceral recent examples of Afrofuturism, Marvel's Black Panther. As Jerry Canavan notes, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and relating the fantastical, superpowered world of Earth 616 to our own space and time, does little to re-envision Black liberation or even trouble white supremacy. And he argues that this is a fatal challenge to the transcendent Afrofuturism of Ryan Coogler's Black Panther. While it is undeniably, the nation state of Wakanda is undeniably a utopian ethno and techno future, the situating of that ethno future within the Marvel Cinematic Universe and by extension, Disney's iron grip upon the aesthetics of modern whiteness and American imagination render Wakanda as an isolationist power. Just like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, uninterested in modernity or colonialism's destructive investment in anti-Blackness outside its own borders. As such, the fantasy of an unfettered Wakanda as a Afrofuturistic utopia that we can long to inhabit is just that. If the US in recent years has reacted so violently to the limited sovereignty of a Black president, how would the West react to an unfettered sovereign nation of African peoples with unquestioned technical, scientific, and military superiority? I'll leave that for you to figure out. Okay, so another criticism that I have of Afrofuturism that I've mentioned already is that I feel it does not pay enough attention to the everyday. And I say this because it's Afrofuturism lingers lovingly upon the aesthetic, upon art. But I feel that art, especially our academic and philosophical discussions arising from our interpretations of it, is simultaneously inseparable and abstracted from everyday life. When I was writing this article, one of the critiques I got is that in many cases, Afrofuturists also consider not just the literary works of artists that are subsumed into the Afrofuturist tradition, but also their biographical, autobiographical works and their histories, right? So somebody mentioned that I should also consider Samuel Chip Delaney's autobiography of as a queer man living in 1950s New York. And while I agree that that is part of the deeper canon of Afrofuturist literary theory, it's not necessarily representative of the way that Afrofuturism presents itself to the world, right? Instead, Afrofuturism is very much invested in a speculative fantastic where Blackness has achieved agency. And I'm not arguing for realism. And I'm also not asking to reduce or have a reductive perspective on the prophetic possibilities, the political valences, or philosophical issues of Black arts and letters. Instead, I'm suggesting that the everyday, as evoked in the mundane and often surreal digital discourses found on social media or in digital media, or as Gilroy says, the profane, contaminated world of Black popular culture offers vital moments of analysis for understanding Black futurity in our present time. Let me offer an example. Hopefully you can hear this. The moderators will tell me if you can't.
You think I'm being typecast?
Yes.
I don't know. You think this cat is typecast? It's a fucking cat, you know? Ain't got much choice. What if he moved to a new neighborhood? You know? Hung out with the poodle crowd, did poodle things, you know, become a poodle. Still be a cat, you know? But what if he convinced himself that he was a poodle and everyone else that he was a poodle? Wouldn't that make him a poodle? Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, weird as shit, but that's a good point. Man, this whole metaphor is bullshit, yo. You hear me? You think everybody don't got a role to play, huh? You think a white boy could have played Omar? You think you could play a president? I could. And I think we've seen the last Black president for a while. I'm just saying. I think you're gonna always be playing some version of Mike. Gangster Mike, old-timer gangster Mike, southern gangster Mike. But I'm not a gangster. Everyone that knows me knows that. Self-denying gangster Mike. Look, I picked these roles. Me, I made this path for myself. Did you? Yeah, did you? Or did they choose you? You think we would be doing what we doing if we had a choice? Huh? Face it, man. Look, we from a certain type of people that come from a type of place that look a type of way. You know what that make us? Black. Typecast. If I were typecast, I'd be in jail or dead. But I'm here. I got out. Got myself out. You sure about that? Yeah.
This video is really hard for me to watch in light of Williams' passing, but I see it as an arrangement of the surreal and quotidian, uh, enabled by film techniques of being able to show representations of the actor in conversation with himself. Right. This video was posted to YouTube by HBO and the Atlantic magazine. When originally aired, the comments rightfully celebrated Williams' acting prowess. And as some of you may know, he's known for his portrayal of Omar, queer robber in The Wire, and most recently in the speculative fiction series Lovecraft Country. And as I mentioned, it's surreal in light of his untimely passing. But I also believe that YouTube offers a dimension, an affordance, right, of discursive capacity that allows it to span space and time, right? And I say this because YouTube is not just a televisual archive or a broadcast channel, but also an online community. And this community has transformed the viewing page for this video into an ad hoc memorial, at once celebrating his life, his talent, and mourning his passing, right? And to me, this is one of the things that Black technoculture captures in a way that Afrofuturism is still working towards. One more example, because to fully articulate what I see as one of the profound differences between Afrofuturism and Black technoculture, I've stumbled upon a concept I call Afro-Optimism. But I'll let this young man explain how I came to it, because I feel like he does it better than I do.
So today I'm thinking about how Black goodbyes aren't actually goodbyes. Like, more often than not, they're not definite at all. Like, there's a lot of see you laters, catch you laters, aight thens, I'll call you back, and if you're ever actually expecting a call back, you're in for a wild surprise. But the reason this kind of fascinates me is because we're all promising each other the idea of a tomorrow. Like, I think for this reason alone, Black goodbyes are revolutionary. Like, how can Black and brown people exist in a world that constantly takes their lives, but then think to promise each other the idea of a tomorrow? That's insane. And it also gives me a lot of hope. So purely and simply, I think the Black goodbye is an act of resistance. It's saying F you to a world that often demands that we live inside of our trauma, and that often mines our trauma for profit. It's saying to that world, I'll see you tomorrow, bright and early, and there's nothing you can do about it. Crazy.
So I love this video. His joy in articulating this concept really speaks through the screen, right? And I use it as an example of Afro-Optimism because as opposed to Afro-Pessimism, Afro-Optimism argues that Blackness is not pathological, right? Or the negation of sociality, right? Instead, Afro-Optimism is a celebration of Black thought amidst the travails of capitalism and modernity. And this video about the Black farewell really speaks to that. The additional part of this, though, is that I argue for Afro-Optimism as an excess of life, one that is not meant specifically to be captured by modernity or capitalism as labor or as profit, right? So in many cases, on my social media spaces, there's constant conversations about converting your hobbies, the things you love to do for relaxation and self-care, to something that you can make money off of in order to survive, right? In an era where labor insists on underpaying you, your institutions like work or school insist on treating you as disposable, right? They say that the one thing that you can do that relieves you of those worries for a moment, you should also make it into a money-making endeavor without ever considering what happens if you don't make money from it, right? So Afro-optimism is that moment before. I call it a para-ontological moment, although I'm not necessarily sure I'm using the term correctly, right? But it speaks to the possibilities of having care and self-repair, or in a more polemic term, Black joy, against what Akil Mbembe calls the desiccation, the soul-sucking nature of modernity, right? I think of Afro-optimism as a celebration of Black thought, as I mentioned, but also, as Fred Moten terms it, a funereal ideology. And funereal, Funereal, not necessarily as being about death, although death is a part of life and should not be railed against or fought against, right? But instead, how death engenders occasions where we celebrate the love that we had for a person who is no longer with us. And Louisiana culture, where I'm from, we have things called second lines, which is people strolling down the street in memory to jazz music, dancing and laughing and singing to celebrate the life of someone who is gone. In other cultures, not just Black American culture or Black diasporic cultures, or even on the continent, right, the African continent, but in other cultures, the Irish wake is a great example of people coming together with drink, with toast to the life of a person. Many of us celebrate life, the lives of those who are no longer with us, because we want to cherish what we had from them, right? But I argue for Blackness, where we're already not considered human in modernity and Western technoculture. Our celebration of the passing of someone speaks to something more than simply just wanting to be human. It speaks to our capacity to have an excess of life, right? It helps us navigate the anti-Blackness and racisms of everyday life as Black folk in this world. A little bit more on Afro-optimism, right? I argue that it begins from the concept of Blackness as sociality, right? And Black digital practice, especially in social media and mobile communication, is a poignant example of Black sociality across space and time. So that young man posted a video of a moment in his life where he took time to reflect upon his own interiority as a member of a community that has specific discursive and cultural practices. And by archiving that video on TikTok, which affords him the capacity to share it across multiple networks and to friends and followers on that particular network, he has transcended space and time from a local moment of reflection to something that can be shared, retweeted, reposted, whatever your favorite term is, and enjoyed by people who are not him, right? But serve as a way to enfold those people into his particular framework for celebrating himself and his culture, right? So in this Black digital practice, this Afro-optimistic Black digital practice, Black identity performances and enactments are appreciated and evaluated as archive, as enactment, as participation, and as future tense. And in the process, Afro-optimism goes a long way towards reducing the phenomenological return, the carceral return of Fanon's Hail, where Frantz Fanon argues that Blackness is reduced upon recognition, right? Instead, Afro-optimism illuminates an agentive Black interiority powered by joy, sometimes by sexuality, and often catharsis, instead of the sterile, rationalist, efficient object position that Western media and technoculture prefers Blackness to remain within in order to denigrate and exploit our capacities and our humanity. So finally, hopefully a full definition of Black technoculture. It incorporates and expands Lonnie Brooks' Afrofuturist concept of digital media as cognitive prosthetic. And I say expand because prosthetic to me implies that you are somehow improving upon the bio as a way to be more fully modern. And I don't think of Black technoculture or Afro-optimism in that way at all. Instead, it is a recognition of our expanded capacities. In the process, Black technoculture rejects Western technoculture's conception of Blackness as a technical object, incapable and undeserving of humanity, right? And Black technoculture is in dialogue with Western aims, not as resistance or accommodation, but as relation. These technological and technical mediations of Black embodiment, Black culture, and being Black, right, and being, I'm sorry, are intensely libidinal and performative, inflecting a generosity of spirit and a faithfulness to the complexities of human experience, a product of a vision accommodating a tragic comic sensibility. So utility and efficiency are not the ultimate aims of Black culture or Black technoculture, right? And as one way to exemplify this using quotidian examples, consider Black designers and inventors who look to improve everyday life, such as Sarah Good, Granville Woods, right? Or one of my favorites, Grand Wizard Theodore, who is a hip hop pioneer who invented the hip hop technique of scratching. And scratching, or that sound that you hear when the needle skips across the record, has become so potent a moment of Black modernity that it has escaped and been captured by the wider culture, right? And finding resonance as a sonic and temporal rupture of dialogue in American television and film. Because I am all about the digital, my work primarily centers on technoculture as cyberculture, which is a really tired term, but I revived it because I really couldn't think of anything that was as resonant to describe the intermingling of the digital, the computational, the algorithmic, and the culture that we bring to it and are enmeshed by it. So Black folk in digital spaces are constantly engaged with a technologically mediated moment, which I'm calling Kairos, right? Reinvesting futurity into present uses of the digital, rather than in faintly possible Black cyborg or Black magical futures. In other words, Blackness is neither post-human nor interested in being so. Moreover, Blackness is also in the Black technoculture amenable to conceptions of the ratchet, or possibilities for Blackness that are not constrained by respectability, appropriate behavior, or modernity. In other words, when Black folk want to act out, that's just as acceptable for Blackness as it is to, say, dress appropriately. One of my favorite moments on my Twitter timeline is there are constantly repeating discussions, right, as happens on Twitter a lot, about how to dress appropriately. For Black boys, one of that conversation is pulling your pants up. The act is referred to as sagging, right, where you can see the boy's underwear as he walks down the street, right? And there are constant exhortations by proponents of Black respectability that if you must pull your pants up so that the world, and by this they mean the white world, will respect you as a human being. And a very cheeky person on the timeline pushed back against this this framing by saying, it's funny you say that because Martin Luther King was shot and killed in a three-piece suit. So obviously, respectability is not an armor against anti-Blackness. Right? And so I recognize then that Blackness does not have to be amenable to civil norms or modernity, and that it instead invests energies into being. A celebration and enactment of the now that incorporates past iniquities and future imaginings. And I'll quote the words of Ronald Walcott, who wrote this in 1972 about the blues, but I feel it applies directly. Black folk inhabit so completely the space that they do have, and they inhabit it so individually and communally, doing so that one does not need to go outward towards the corridor of time to discover possibility, for one has found it in its own depths. And I feel that this particular quote references directly my understanding of what goes on in Black social media spaces, in Black culture, and offers possibilities for reassessing how Afrofuturism can understand Black futures and technofutures. One more example. I mentioned Black Kairos, right? And I describe it tongue in cheek as the libidinal tension of you should have just sat there and ate your food, right? And if you need me to explain it later, I will, right? It is simultaneously racial performance and enactment, right? Discursive invention, but significantly appropriate, timely engagement within communicative and cultural context. And by appropriate here, I don't mean that it has certain standards of propriety. What I mean is that you are responding to the prompt in a way that expands upon, signifies upon, or continues the conversation, right? And time is really important with Kairos, but for Black culture, it is understood differently from the Western conceptualization. Timeliness, or the lack thereof, is a significant aspect of Black identity and discursive identity. For example, I argue that the concept of colored people time describes a joyous disregard for modernity and labor capitalism, or I might be late, but I'm always on time. One more example of the Black digital and technoculture and the post-present is the phrase on red. Now, to my Gen X ears, on red insists on hearing it as unread, UNREAD, right? But you probably should hear it through a Southern accent, a Black US Southern accent, so it's on red, right? Which when considered as an element of interactivity in computer-mediated communication, signals that one, the sender has activated the read-receipt function of their messaging client, allowing them to know whether their recipient has received the message, and two, that the client app has received the message, but the recipient has not viewed it. Right? What I've learned about the term, however, is much more inventive. When the recipient leaves a message on red, it is a signal that the recipient has received and viewed the message, but has deliberately not responded. This action deposits the sender in a textual purgatory, a virtual holding pattern or limbo, left unsure as to whether they will receive a response. More sinisterly, the sender is also recast semiotically through text, through time, and through sociality as to whether they are still a member of the recipient's communicative and affiliative network. Right? So I see these moments of Black Kairos, and I am being greedy and stingy and limiting them to Blackness. I know that they happen in other cultures, but I see them acted out in many different potent ways on my own timeline and social media spaces, right? As part and parcel of Black technoculture. So I want to talk about, to end my provocation, I feel that Afrofuturism and Black technoculture should be considered a both and. So Black technoculture and as Afrofuturism, right? Afrofuturism is often articulated as a re-envisioning of Blackness's imbrication within and liberation from Western technology, right? And this part always gives me pause, because many conversations I enter into, having become an inherent of libidinal economy as espoused by Leotard and Barth, right? When I talk about Black joy, I usually get the rejoinder, well, we need to get free before we can talk about being happy. And in return, I say, how can you understand or enjoy your liberation if you haven't figured out how to experience joy? In the words of the philosopher Michael Williams, also known as Cat Williams, how are you going to be mad at breakfast, right? Are you going to gangbang on bacon, right? You must, even activists need to eat. And I'm sure they enjoy their pancakes before they go out to march and fight against injustice. Right? Sorry about the digression, I just can't help it. Given how Black bodies are figured in the West as object, never as subject, Afrofuturism takes great pains to highlight art and literary forms where Blackness recovers or reimagines Black agency through speculative, technological, and artistic means, which includes biological and genetic, right? Janelle Monáe's Arch Android is a great one, right? And I agree that its close readings of Black arts and movements have built a compelling theoretical approach to envisioning Blackness and technological agency. For Black technoculture, reorienting Western technoculture to incorporate Blackness as an agentive moment possibility invites an inquiry into the possibilities of Black futurity as technology, in the same way that Blackness often stands for the best of American entertainment and culture. Black technoculture highlights the possibilities of futurity inherent in the vivification of everyday life, often archived in our communicative infrastructure we know as the internet. It is often grimy, sometimes pornographic, mostly banal, and these are offered by Black sociality, subjectivity, and digital practice. In capturing the contributions of regular folk thinking through their own engagements with technology's promises and fears, Black technoculture argues for Black digital practices, investment of energies into being and of the moment with possibilities for a post-present, making a dollar out of 15 cents or making a way for a better day, right? And so I see Black technoculture as the distal manifestation, right? The method and technique for Afrofuturism's, I'm sorry, the social scientific in my own thinking, it's usually just interpretive, right? Of Afrofuturism's literary analysis and theory. So in conclusion, Black technoculture complements Afrofuturism and its dismissal of Western technoculture's figuration of Blackness as a human thing, human machine, or human in flux. And by combining the two, we gain valuable perspectives on how futures are created by everyday folk living in the present. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for such an interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I am sure that many of our attendees have questions to ask. So just as a reminder to our audience, you may now raise your hand using the tool, and I will call your name so you can ask your questions. And if you would rather use the chat, I will read them out loud. So do we have any questions? Well, then maybe let me just break the ice with a very general comment slash question. I was thinking of the ways in which, as you mentioned, Black technoculture serves to offer alternative models of Black life, as well as a supportive community in which new discursive identities can be built, which is ultimately an act of care, of social reparation and liberation. And I was wondering if these positive effects are often questioned, criticized, or misread within these very digital spaces. So, for instance, you mentioned the dilemma of what should come first, joy or freedom. But I was also thinking of perhaps more condescending criticism based on lack of understanding or empathy, or even discourses of anti-Black hatred. So, could you perhaps expand on these?
So, two ways to think about that. Anti-Blackness is not necessarily something that is limited to whiteness, right? In many ways, respectability, I argue for as a carceral ideology, where they hate possibilities for Blackness that isn't modern, right? And so in some ways, you see this on social media where people will rail against people who use the digital inappropriately, right? Meaning they don't necessarily respect the norms of digital spaces. I usually get in trouble on Twitter because sometimes I put the @ for somebody who I want to talk to in a tweet that they really shouldn't be paying attention to, if that makes sense, right? They're like, stop snitch tagging is what they call it on Twitter, right? And so that's a contravention of the digital norms, right? But moreover, there are contraventions of social norms, right, on whether appropriate behavior is being enacted. So just yesterday, popular entertainer was shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee, a rapper named Young Dolph. And one of the people I follow, taking up an earlier conversation thread about Black relationships, what actually said, all she said was that I appreciate that this entertainer celebrated the woman he had kids with as an essential person in his life, not as a baby mother, right? Not as someone who he just had kids with, but as a full participant in the life that he had, even though they weren't married, right? Which to me is a relatively innocuous statement, right? But so many folk on my timeline, a lot of them women, but not solely women, and they're all Black, jumped on this person. They basically called her out of her name, called her a bird, called her all kind of other names, right? Because they felt that was not an appropriate moment to talk about his relationship with the woman when he had just been killed. And I don't get that, right? I understand why people say, well, you should observe his death first and then talk about his relationship. But his wife was part of his life. We're celebrating his life. And so at that moment, I think it is appropriate to talk about what he did well in life, as well as the sad circumstances of his passing, right? And I see this also, so I use that particular example, which is hyper specific, but I see it not just in Black communities, but in diasporic and immigrant communities as well, where social media is used as a tool to chastise younger folk for their lack of participation in social and civic infrastructures, whether they vote, whether they pay taxes, right? Or whether or not they don't work hard enough, whether they don't conform to capitalist norms, particularly older folk. And I'm including my generation in this, as well as a Gen X person. We love to chastise young people because we feel they don't work as hard as we did in order to overcome what society is, conveniently ignoring how society has changed since we went to college for, $500 a semester, right? We didn't have to accrue hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and then face an uncertain job market and then couldn't afford a home. Instead, we choose to focus on libidinal tensions of you should work harder. That makes you a real person, right? And social media is really good at that, right? And so for me, arguing for Black joy is a recognition that these social media spaces are a form of catharsis, right? So even if the catharsis is oriented towards bringing someone down or hurting someone, it's still an expression that somehow gives pleasure to the person saying it. Does that make sense? And I struggle to think of a future or even a past where these moments did not always exist, right? So a few years ago, my mind was blown because they found that in the ruins of Pompeii, which was destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in something AD, right? There were pornographic graffiti on the wall, right? We love to think of the Romans and those people who inhabited Italy at this time as figures of great aesthetic grace and refinement, but they were just as libidinal as we are, right? And I feel like the internet is also preserving those same libidinal capacities for joy, for sexuality, for identity, for things that make us squirm, right? I'm sure Dr. Pimple Popper will be very inscrutable to future generations. They're like, why are they watching videos of this woman extracting pus and stuff from a person's bumps, right? But that is part of who we are, right? And I feel that by archiving those moments and by being able to revisit them and commenting on them, thus extending their paratextual life, I feel as if we've stumbled into a moment of futurity, right? One that we should not just focus on those exceptional individuals who have created art that resonates with us about a future, but also ourselves, right, as future beings enabled by technology. Sorry, that was a long answer, my bad.
Thank you so much. Yes, I agree that that movement of the merging of the tenses is actually very, very interesting. We actually have a question from Laura. So, Laura, if you're here and you want to ask.
Hi, I think the raise hands are like inversed. So I was actually the last one to raise my hand, but since I'm already on camera, I will go. I wanted to ask you, since the moment that you mentioned music and the culture in Louisiana with jazz and stuff, I wanted to ask you about Afrofuturism in music, and then you actually did mention Janelle Monáe's arc Android, and yeah, I'm just very interested in Afrofuturism in music specifically. I love Sun Ra and Janelle Monáe, of course, and King Brit's project, Flushton, what's it called? Flushton Paradigm. So yeah, I will just love you to talk a little bit more about Afrofuturism specifically in music and how that relates to cyber culture and everything that you've been speaking about.
So relating it to cyber culture is a little difficult for me. I have some small knowledge of music as a fan, right? So I know that King Brit's Flushton Paradigm is specifically referencing The Fifth Element, right, by Luc Besson, right? I find that for me as a scholar, the blues is much more evocative of what I want to see out of Afrofuturism than jazz or even Janelle Monáe's R&B, right? But the difference is that the blues doesn't explicitly reference a technocultural or technological capacity, right? And so the reference in Sun Ra Space is the place, right? The George Clinton's Atomic Dog, right? Or Janelle Monáe's The Arch Android is that they explicitly interpolate technoprothesis, right? Or futuristic imaginings of alien landscapes and soundscapes into their conceptualization of Blackness, right? Which I find fascinating and incredibly entertaining, right? I would leave it to you, though, to tell me more about how you see Afrofuturism in their bodies of work connecting directly to the digital. Because for me, as a hip hop scholar, I'm fascinated with the ways that hip hop specifically brings itself into being through technological implements such as the cell phone, the pager, and other things, but also through the music video. So Missy Elliott, to me, right, is an Afrofuturistic artist, right? Even though she doesn't necessarily reference Afrofuture in her music, her videos particularly have engendered Afrofuturist sensibilities through her willingness to play with image representation and modernity. But I think you can answer this question better than I can.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but thinking a little bit more about music, I was also thinking about production in itself, like how you bring this technology and our own technoculture into the music, into the composition of the music, right? And how this more technological sounding and you know the tools that they use, the technological tools that you can use now to compose music, and how that maybe brings or connects to the types of musics that you were speaking about, blues and jazz and R&B and all these things. And I think that evolution is interesting. And
I do.
But
I told you had a better answer than I did.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Well, we have another question from Saskia.
Hi, yes.
Hey.
Please excuse, I
Girl, I'm right there with you.
after my morning walk with my dog, so I haven't yet. I'm put on my face, so to say, for today. I found your talk really interesting. I also work on Afrofuturism, and I have struggled as well, feeling that while it is very inclusive, and I really love that aspect of it, right? So bringing in these multiplicities of areas, right, for how we can re-envision the present as well as future, and really put Black people in these roles as being agents, right? And giving them agency. I also feel a little like the theoretical practical tools aren't quite so well defined. Like, so, also how do you apply this in the praxis, right? But also how do you, and not to say that we have to always evaluate, but we're scholars now, right? So it's like, how do I go about saying, right? Janelle Monáe's, a dirty computer does X, Y, Z, and here we have Afrofuturism, at its best or worst, depending on how you take her piece, right? So I really like that. I feel like you were trying to do this with the Black technoculture aspect, right? And Afro. Hold on, I didn't write it down. Was it positivity?
Afro-Optimism.
Optimism, right? No, positivity, sorry, optimism. But then I was wondering, and so I hate, like, am I just reducing your whole argument? But it felt a little bit like part of the push for this is, I didn't really notice this per se, but after your talk, I'm like, maybe this is existing, a high-low divide, right? About sort of what right now is being pushed at the forefront of what are good representations of Afrofuturism are what we consider these high forms, right? And so your average TikTok video, or, and of course, respectability politics within Black culture is such a thing, right? It's such a thing that we have a hard time getting past, I guess I would say. Do you think there's a little bit of that going on? And so this might be a way to address it, or I need to do more research?
No, you're already well along the path where you need to be. I do see a high-low divide. And I think your question is particularly apropos for the way I'm thinking, because one of the things you mentioned that I probably should have talked more about in this presentation is the idea of accessibility. So can only artists be Afrofuturists, right? Is it just the jazz musician? Is it just the poet? Or can everyday people enact Afrofuturist perspective as well, right? And so that's what I tried to come towards, right, with the use of the video by the young man on TikTok, right? And the work that I do, which I don't mention at all, I don't mention much of in this presentation. I have a method called critical technocultural discourse analysis. Don't write that down. But what I do in that one is I say, we should evaluate technology from the perspective of the people who are using it, as opposed to an under theorized or lightly articulated Western framework, right? So instead of saying there's a digital divide because Black people are always on the wrong side of the divide, what happens if you look at technology from a Black perspective? Right? You then begin to get new understandings of Black people saying, well, I want to use this technology because I want a job. But what does this technology do to segregate me from the wider spaces of possibility offered by the internet? And what can I do with it differently in ways that speak to my own cultural representation that are not tied to whiteness, right? And so I have a method, which I don't discuss here, right? But if you're interested, I can send it to you, that does some work towards trying to say, here's a way to try to understand Afrofuturist moments as enacted by everyday people using digital technologies, which I'm clear in saying are possibilities for future agency and enactment, right? And so I can send that to you later if you wish.
Yes, I will definitely post my email address. I think I was talking with another colleague about Afrofuturism, and it's so big, and sometimes it's like, oh, it's just getting bigger and bigger. And my colleague at the time was like, but isn't that a very either scholarist or perhaps even Western approach to try to narrow it down, right? We have to confine it, we have to box it. And I was like, and maybe because it's a Black thing too, right? We can't let this explode out and do what it needs to do, basically, right?
Right.
And so I really like this your approach about being more aware of the everyday practices and ways in which your everyday person rewrites their future in the present. All right. Oh, that's powerful. It's powerful. Cool.
Thank
cool.
you. Thank you very much.
Well, we have one final question by Anna.
Okay.
Yes, I know that you have done quite some work as well on Black Twitter, and something that I found very intriguing about it, and it is possibly because I work on Chicanic studies, and I find that in a way Latinx Twitter has some things that sort of resonate with Black Twitter. I was going to ask you if you could expand a little bit on it, especially I think it's very interesting how you've been saying that the humor, the kind of humor that characterizes Black Twitter is quite cathartic, and it is a tool, a weapon, means to deal and to cope with what is in reality your everyday life and whatever happens in your life as a Black person, as someone belonging to the Black community.
So if I understand your question, you're asking me if I see similar things in the Latinx community, the Chicanx community as well?
No, if you can just maybe talk a little bit about that function of Black Twitter.
Okay.
As I imagine that maybe some of our attendees do not know that you work quite a lot on that as well. And I think it's a very interesting part of your work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So 100 years ago, when I first wrote about Black Twitter, I made, at the time, a startling claim that Twitter is a space for ritual catharsis. Ritual, and that it's kind of like, at the time, it was kind of like a haiku. You only had 140 characters in which to say something that would engage people, right? And catharsis, because in that amount of space and time, you can, the only way people, the easiest way to get people to engage with your work is to say something that will affect them powerfully, right? So using affect as a communicative strategy. We've seen this exploited on Facebook, right, in recent years, Instagram and YouTube as well. Twitter for me remains kind of a pure form of that affect, even though Twitter has been rightly described as a hell site for women and minorities, right? Where men and others use the site as a way to harass women, right? And dox them, rape threats, death threats, and the like. I would argue that that's also catharsis, just not a kind that's welcome, right? But Twitter, I think, because of its short format and because of the ways in which people compile groups of followers, right? Not friends, right? Because you can distinguish between people you follow whose content will be delivered to you, and then people can follow you to get your content delivered to them as well. It affords the building of affiliative communities, right? So Black Twitter is one, Latinx Twitter is one, but even that Latinx community separates itself out into Dominicano Twitter, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rican Twitter, Mexican Twitter, Colombian Twitter. And I find those conversations to be fascinating in a way that Black American Twitter doesn't have access to, because those populations still have national origins, cultural origins, and language similarities to build upon in a way that Black Twitter doesn't, right? Having lived in New York for many years, right, it was always interesting to me that when I went to certain parts of New York, I was hailed as being Dominican, right? Because the Dominican Republic, in part because of the fact that it's right next door to Haiti, has a large African population, right? And so Black folk are hailed as Dominican, speak Dominican language, right? Even if they're not clearly represented in the media, the Latinx media for that area or for Central and South America, right? And so it's interesting then to me to watch discussions of Afro-Latinx engagement, right? Who's passing for white, whether or not someone like Amara La Negra, who is dark-skinned with the Afro, is Black enough to be Black, or Latinx enough to be Latin, right? Because those are the concerns that I have with my own Black Twitter engagement. Am I Black enough to be Black on Twitter, right? And so those particular things are fascinating to me. And I find other nationalities, other diasporic communities. I'm thinking specifically of Middle Eastern communities, but also Asian and South Asian communities have similar concerns that they are easily able to articulate on Twitter because of the call and response, the quick engagement and feedback that you get from other people, which isn't necessarily possible on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube. You can say something, somebody will reply to it, you can block them because they'll say something stupid, right? Or you can talk to them and then build out longer conversations. So Twitter affords this type of community building and engagement and discourse in a way that I find engaging, for lack of a better word. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I don't even remember. I saw a tweet by someone a while ago that I thought it was very, very interesting and on point, saying that they had posted something and it went sort of a little bit viral. And they were kind of shocked and they didn't want it to be viral because they said that the tweet was not meant to go outside their Twitter neighborhood. So it was not meant to be really read or shared by people that weren't part of this sort of community that they were feeding with their tweet feed. So I think it's very on point what you say as well, that it's a way where there are good things and then still you have this conflict that you have to sort of live up to your participation in Mexican Twitter or whatever, because there will be people that right away in a second would tell you that you are a whitexican and you shouldn't be commenting on that, So right. I think it's absolutely interesting and so fascinating how these kind of communities work and how they shift very quickly.
Agreed.
I mean, it's always moving all the time.
I was just told about an artist named Rosales. She's situated in Los Angeles, and she has a project called Veteranas, right, where she's asking people to contribute portraits of their life in East LA and post them to Instagram, right? And I find that fascinating as a way of archiving a particular Chicana sensibility, right, in a digital space. but I also wonder what are the possibilities of talking back to that space. So Instagram is not a space where you can talk back in the same way that you can on Twitter. And so is it simply just an archive for visual viewing? Or as I would prefer, a space where people can post their photos and people can then comment. Well, maybe that's not always the best thing, but people then can talk back to those photos, right? And would say, hey, I recognize that. And so there was something that happened on Twitter a few years back called Thanksgiving for Black Families, right? And people didn't post images of their own families, but they started talking about what are the commonplaces, what are the traditions, what are the things that happen when Black people get together for the American holiday of Thanksgiving, right? And it became this really positively generative space because we realized that even though we thought things were just happening in our own families, it was a shared experience across our entire culture, right? And I see that happening more and more often on Twitter in ways that I wish would happen in other spaces.
Yeah, I think that Instagram is a bit clunky in that way. It's really a place where you're just showing yourself off.
Yes.
Basically, in most cases, it's really showing off. I feel it's just like a shopping window where you're just putting out your content, and the comments really don't allow for any kind of interaction that can be, I don't know, enriching or anything, right?
No.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for the question. That was a good one. I'm afraid I have to leave. I don't know how much longer we have in the session, but I have to go to another presentation.
Yes, actually, I was going to say that thank you, because that was so very interesting, and you're certainly giving us lots of food for thought. But unfortunately, we're running out of time. So for our audience, if you feel comfortable turning your cameras on, please join me in thanking André Brock for this wonderful presentation. And also thank you all for attending. We feel truly honored to have all of you in here.
Same. Thank you all for inviting me. This was good.